Hi, Salam Alaikum. It's Leslie again with another video, and perhaps I can introduce this video by basically mentioning why I'm doing it in the first place. And basically, the purpose of this video, or perhaps I should say the main purpose of this video, is to give me an opportunity, so to speak, as it were, to do a rehearsal of sorts, because later this evening, more precisely in about 2.5 hours, I will be part of a panel in via Zoom at a conference in the United Kingdom. The conference is organized by the Oxford Institute for British Islam, and I was invited to participate in a conference. I could not participate physically, but I basically suggested, well, if you can find a place for me to do something or say something online, then certainly I'm interested. So they basically responded affirmatively, and I was given basically 15 minutes to present some ideas that I have developed about the methodology of Islam, the traditional methodology of Islam, and on the question of how the Islam as a religion of peace was in fact rearticulated through this methodology, which I believe was flawed, and I'll get into in just a few moments. The question I'm looking at is how this, Islam as a religion of peace was rearticulated through the application of a problematic methodology, which relied extensively on the so-called doctrine of abrogation, specifically of the peace verses by the sword verses. So this transformation in our knowledge, in our understanding of Revelation or the Quran, to be more precise, has taken place as a result of the work of some ulama, not all ulama, of course, but I will refer to them as, or I refer to them as the hawkish ulama, the ones who felt comfortable with stating that Allah Ta'ala, in fact, wants us to go to war against non-Muslims every year, once a year, in order to fulfill our religious requirements. And they called this kind of warfare, which is also known as offensive warfare or aggressive war, they called it Jihad al-Talab, and they in fact made it into a sixth pillar of Islam. Now you can find an article online on this, several articles in fact. One is by Hamid Mawani, and the article is called "The Tension Between Quran and Sunnah." You can find it online, free in PDF format. Another article I would recommend is an article by Niaz A. Shah, that's SHAH. The article is called "The Use of Force in Islamic Law," and it has been published by the Oxford University Press and republished by the European Journal of International Law. The name of this paper, as I mentioned, is "The Use of Force in Islamic Law," and it may also be found free in PDF format online. On top of that, I could perhaps mention one more reference, and that is, these are some book reviews, specifically a book review by a Tunisian scholar, Rashid Ghanouchi, which this book review may be found online, and it is a book review of Yusuf al-Qaradawi's major work on the fiqh of jihad. And I think that Ghanouchi also brings some interesting insights about the position being taken by Yusuf Qaradawi now on this doctrine of Jihad al-Talab. He, like others, or he is also, how do I put this? Qaradawi appears to be backing away from the traditional commitment to Jihad al-Talab as an essential part of the teaching of Islam. He basically says that, according to the book reviews I have looked at, I haven't actually read the book itself, but of course that would be better if I read the book myself. Apparently it's a huge book. At the moment I don't have the time to plow through such a big book, but just referring to Ghanouchi's book review and some other book reviews, it is pretty clear that al-Qaradawi is, as it were, backpedaling on this notion of aggressive jihad for several reasons. One is it is actually incompatible with the teaching of Al-Quran, which teaches that there is no compulsion in religion, but of course aggressive jihad involves a great great deal of compulsion. And another reason is that, how do I put this? It is against the Quran, and there's nothing really. What's the other reason why Qaradawi is rejecting this? This doctrine? I think that he is basically also has developed doubts about the traditional methodology of basically of interpreting the teaching of the Quran, and this is a question I would need to look at. But my feeling is that he is also experiencing some doubts about the validity of the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword, or two verses of the sword, because one of the verses of the sword is located in, actually they are both located in Surah number 9, Surah At-Tawbah, and the first one is verse number 5, the second one is verse number 29. Both of these verses have been interpreted, or rather misinterpreted, by the ulama to mean that offensive war has become incumbent on the Muslims within the last 1 or 2 years of the Prophet's life, and that the counsel to, the peace verses, essentially, that most of which were revealed in Makkah, were basically abrogated by the verse of the sword in Surah number 9, particularly verse number 5. So we are talking about here the question of what is the right way to understand the Quran, and how do we arrive at conclusions. So my idea to do a presentation at the institute arose out of the how do I put it, I felt that it was important to highlight that the entire doctrine of jihad al-talab, to which I actually refer to as a form of state terrorism, because the entire community is launching an attack on another community, even when that other community is not attacking the Muslim community. Now, this to me seems like a pure act of aggression. That is why I use that strong language, and I refer to it as a form of state terrorism, which should be rejected and should have never been part of the teaching of mainstream Islam in the first place. However, we find that some well-known names have supported this doctrine of jihad al-talab. I don't want to mention these names at the moment here. However, you will find them mentioned on page 29 of a book written by Saleh Ansari and Usama Hassan, who will be, the latter of which will be one of the speakers, in fact, at the conference which I will be attending as well. And this book is called Tackling Takfiri Theology of Terror, and it can be also found online free in PDF format. The book is actually the book is edited by Adam Dean and Majid Nawaz, both of the Quilliam Foundation, and I believe it was published just last year. So it's a very recent document, a very eloquent statement and a rejection of this false teaching of aggressive or offensive jihad. So, and this has to be done partly because there are still people who are holding on to this, problematic doctrine. One of the present-day ulama that still held on to this teaching of jihad al-talab was none other than Said Ramadan al-Bouti, who, by the way, died in a bomb blast a few years ago. I don't know whether we can say, as we say in Canada, what goes around comes around, but anyway, he was one of the proponents of jihad al-talab and claimed that this holy war in the form of aggressive jihad is still valid. Now, the Quran, yes, it does permit fighting, but it permits fighting only in self-defense and in cases of oppression. So the Muslims are allowed to, and perhaps in fact expected to, fight to defend themselves from aggression by others. They are not expected to become aggressors themselves. So this whole doctrine of jihad al-talab turned the teaching of Islam as a religion of peace completely on its head, upside down. And for this we can thank some of the, what I call the hawkish ulama, as I mentioned, some of whose names you can find in that book which I just mentioned, and elsewhere as well. These ulama, which also include at least one imam, leader of the 4 leading schools of thought in Sunni Islam, they base their conclusion on the basis of the acceptance of the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword. So, for example, example, they believe ask us to believe that Allah Ta'ala abrogated no fewer than 120 peace verses of the Quran with one solitary verse, the so-called verse of the sword, found in Surah number 9, verse number 5. Now, this doctrine of this idea that a single verse abrogated 120 peace verses is referred to by Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali, who was an Al-Azhar sheikh. This notion that a solitary verse a militant verse abrogated 120 peace verses, he calls this idea, I quote, and please forgive my strong language, it is not me who said that, but it is what Muhammad Ghazali wrote. He called it, I quote, crassest stupidity, end of quote. And I think if you really sit down and think about it, I think you may conclude that he was not far off the mark when he arrived at this conclusion. So in other words, we have a problem in traditional exegesis, jurisprudence, and jurisprudence. By exegesis I mean tafsir, or the interpretation of the Quran, and by jurisprudence I mean the process of fiqh, or the process of arriving at the rulings or laws of the Sharia from its source, or as some people would claim, sources. They use the word plural. So what I'm trying to say is that the doctrine of Jihad al-Talab was a result of the application of a problematic methodology of the interpretation of the Quran, which utilized the recourse to abrogation in order to basically cancel 120 peace verses, and that this cancellation of the peace verses allowed these hawkish ulama to transform Islam as a religion of peace into Islam as a religion of war. So now in this process of reinterpreting religion, which by the way was done at the request of some of the rulers at the time, and this this perspective you can find expressed in a book by Muhammad Shahrur. The book was published in 2007 in Damascus, Syria. It was an instant bestseller and went through many reprints. But of course, it also also elicited a lot of adverse response, especially from, as you might expect, traditional ulama who really objected to Shahrur's new way of reading the Quran. So I would say judge for yourself. In any case, the book is also available free online in PDF format, and name of the book is Quran, Morality and Critical Reason. It is the only book out of Shahrur's books that has been translated into English. The remainder of his books, I believe, are available, but at this time only in Arabic. However, I do highly recommend this book, along of course with some others, but I would say that this particular book is probably at the top of my list, at least, of the books that accurately and cogently analyze the predicaments faced by the contemporary by Muslim society and the Ummah in general, and in its attempts to deal with the heritage of the past, and including some of the baggage of the past, some of which includes these problematic notions and practices such as the one I mentioned already, the doctrine of abrogation. So now there's more baggage, so to speak. Perhaps I can mention one or two additional examples. One would be making assumptions about the Quran which are themselves rejected by the Quran. Let me mention three. Some of the traditional ulama are asking us to believe that the Quran is other than what it presents itself as. The Quran presents itself as a clear book. It says, Haza Kitabul Mubin. This is a clear book. But some of the traditionalist ulama are asking us to believe that actually, no, this is not quite the case, because there are some words or verses in the Quran which are, at least to them, unclear and ambiguous. So these ulama even render the meaning of the word mutashabihat, which means allegorical. They render the meaning of this term as unclear or ambiguous. Well, I'm sorry, mutashabihat does not mean ambiguous, it means allegorical. It's a famous word occurring in verse 7 in Surah number 3. So that is another problem with, traditional, some of the traditional, rendition of the Quran may be found in the way some of the traditional ulama rendered the meaning of the word hikmah. The word hikmah in Arabic means wisdom, yet some of the traditional ulama are rendering this word to mean the sunnah of the Prophet. Once again, this is not the case. This is taking serious liberties with the meaning with the Arabic language, and I'm really puzzled and surprised that anyone would have stooped to this methodology of trying to put across, their points of view, because it seems to me that one reason why this word hikmah was rendered as the sunnah of the Prophet, because whoever did that, and again I won't mention any name, but this is generally well known in the literature. Whoever rendered the word hikmah as the sunnah of the Prophet did it most likely because he could not find any other verse to support the notion that we, the Muslims, are explicitly asked in the Quran to follow the sunnah, what they present to us as the sunnah of the Prophet, together and alongside with the Quran. The Quran itself asks us to follow the Quran. Yes, it does say that the Prophet is, a good example for us, but that is also stated about Abraham. So peace be on them both. So we need to be very careful about how we, render the meaning of some of these Arabic terms. We fellows, who have come to Islam, from other faiths like myself, are sometimes advised to brush up on our Arabic. And indeed, yes, I have been brushing up on my Arabic. But judging by the way some of the, classical ulama are rendering the meanings of some of the words, I have a feeling that they could have used a little bit of brushing up their own Arabic, if you ask me. But anyway, to come back to the main topic, I mentioned that I wanted to give a couple of examples of, the problems in the methodology of, interpreting the Quran in the traditional methodology. Another problem is the claim by traditional ulama that the Quran has a second weakness because, after all, ambiguity or the presence of ambiguous verses in the Quran is an example or a manifestation of something of a flaw, right? A perfect document would not be ambiguous and would not be unclear. So whenever the ulama say that the Quran contains unclear words and expressions and verses, what they are really saying is that it is not quite so perfect as it is being presented. But the Quran says that it is a clear book, it says it is a complete book, and it says that it is a coherent book because we will not find any contradictions in it, although that has also happened according to some traditionists. So whenever someone says that the Quran contains unclear or ambiguous passages, what they are basically doing is kind of like undermining the credibility of the Quran and putting doubt into people's minds about the perfection and the inimitability of the Quran. Doesn't Al Quran say in one verse that if all the men and jinn got together and tried to produce something similar to the Quran, they could not succeed? They would not succeed precisely because of it is inimitable. Now, and we are even challenged by Allah Ta'ala to produce at least to produce 10 surahs like the surahs in the Quran if we do not believe that this book is actually from the Almighty. And if we cannot produce 10 surahs, we are challenged to produce at least one surah. Now, look what happened. I certainly didn't take up the challenge because I don't feel that I can produce anything comparable to the Quran. However, that doesn't mean that other people didn't. A number of people actually took up the challenge, and these people actually produced not just one surah or 10 surahs or even one book. They produced 6 books of text which they claim is like the Quran, or even equal in some ways to the Quran. And what are these books that I'm referring to? These books are the books of the so-called hadith, the hadith books. Do we not have 6 collections of hadith, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and 4 others? And are not these collections of the hadith presented to us as revelation, wahi, a second form of revelation, and even equal, yes, you heard me correctly, equal to the Quran. And this allegation of equality of the Quran with of the hadith books with the Quran actually is supported, quote unquote, by a tradition attributed to the Prophet, peace be on him. And the tradition says that the Prophet allegedly said that, I quote, "I was given two things, the Quran and something equal to it." End of quote. In brackets, it says the word hadith. Now, this hadith was quoted by Ibn Baz on his website, and he used the word equal, and this hadith was also quoted by Taha Jabir Alwani in his book, which I also recommend. The book is called Reviving the Balance. It was published in 2017 and is available also in PDF format on the internet free. And I believe the title of the book is, as I mentioned, Reviving the Balance, and he is referring here, I believe, to the balance between Quran and Sunnah. His rendition of the hadith also uses the word equal, although the Arabic term used in the original Arabic is mithlihi, which can also be translated as something similar. So now we have a body of 6 more books which claim to be either similar or equal to the Quran, which also claim to be a revelation. Now, what do we make of that? One thought I had, and I will share it with you, how do we describe this practice of of elevating 6 books of traditions which are at bottom really narrations, man-made narrations, which are presented to us coming from Allah? Now, are the books of the hadith from Allah or not? I have my doubts, because the hadiths recorded in the hadith books are not the words of Allah. In fact, when you look more closely, you will discover that the hadiths are not even the words of the Prophet, at least not verbatim words of the Prophet. Verbatim means, it's a Latin expression, it means the exact very same words that the Prophet, peace be on him, himself used. How many of the hadiths in these collections are the exact same words that the Prophet himself used? I don't think you will find any. So if you apply a very strict standard for the authentication of hadith, and if you say that an authentic hadith would have to be the exact verbatim words of the Prophet, I think the conclusion becomes inescapable that if that is the criterion you apply, which was a criterion, by the way, that was applied by Imam Abu Hanifa, who would only accept hadiths that were the exact verbatim words of the Prophet, as reported by Daniel Brown in his book called Rethinking Tradition in Islamic Thought, and that is another book I recommend. So if we apply this very strict standard for the authentication of hadith, we will find that we don't have any authentic hadith except perhaps the Quran itself, which is in fact presented to us by the Quran itself as the best hadith, Ahsanul Hadith, in which we also find the best tafsir, Ahsanul Tafsir. So this is another example I'm mentioning here as an example of problematic methodology. The problem here is in elevating man-made narrations akin to hearsay or folklore to the level of revelation. You see, this is a very big claim. If you take hearsay to an ordinary court of law, it will not be accepted as evidence because it is hearsay. But what we know as the ahadith, they are actually paraphrases of what the Prophet allegedly said. They are therefore, that makes them hearsay also. So, but here the Muslim ulama have made into law a text that basically amounts to hearsay or rumors, and they are telling us that this text is equal to the Quran. Now, please help me out if I'm missing something, but to me this sounds really very problematic. I even thought of a name for it, and I'm suggesting the expression, quote, scriptural politism, to refer, end of quote, to refer to this practice of identifying man-made text as revelation and designating it as an equal of the Quran. I think this is highly problematic. But this is not an isolated opinion. In fact, this has been part of the mainstream opinion. I have even heard some sheikhs, here I won't mention any names, but it has been mentioned in some of the YouTube videos that I have seen that the so-called mutawatir hadith is equal to the Quran. Now, please help me out. how can the words of human beings ever be equal to the words of what we consider the words of Allah? I mean, don't you think this is a very serious claim and very false claim to make? And yet we hear this repeated time and time again, that the mutawatir hadiths are equal to the Quran, and or that there are as many as 500 hadiths that are equal to the Quran. I'm shocked, quite frankly. Now, this is one of the major problems in the methodology of interpreting the Quran, equating the words of human beings with the words of God. That, I think, is very serious, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm suggesting that we can think of it as a kind of scriptural polytheism, and that has to be overcome and addressed. In fact, Jabir Alwani, in his book I mentioned earlier, Reviving the Balance, he basically calls for a methodology whereby all the traditions could be, basically subordinated to the authority of the Quran. No tradition that contradicts the Quran should ever be included as in the collections of the Hadith and designated as Sahih, as authentic. In fact, Alwani goes on to say that any tradition that contradicts the Quran should be automatically considered as fabricated and therefore rejected. And we do have such, such hadiths, which brings me to another problem in the traditional methodology, this time of jurisprudence. Jurisprudence, the process of deriving the rulings of the Sharia from its source, the Quran, although some traditional ulama claim that there are 7 other sources of the law. I don't want to go through that again. I think I've covered that already in some of the previous videos a few times. So another example of a problem, this time in jurisprudence, is the practice of allowing man-made hadiths, man-made traditions, not only as was done in exegesis to judge, the Quran, and this was made explicit in saying that the Sunnah judges the Quran, as Sunnah qadi ala Quran, meaning that the Sunnah, or the words of the transmitters, explain the Quran. Here the assumption is that the transmitters basically can explain better than Allah himself. Now think about this claim, but let's go back to jurisprudence here. So and by the way, the exegetes also claimed when they elevated the Sunnah, not just to the level of equality with the Quran, they actually pushed it higher than the Quran when they said that the Sunnah can actually, or the Hadith, I'm using the term now in Shafi's sense, he made no difference between Hadith and Sunnah. To him they were the same. So when people say that Sunnah judges the Quran, they mean the Hadith, in Shafi's sense, they mean the Hadith judge the, Quran. And I have the last video I made was precisely on this topic. It was on the question of does the Sunnah judge the Quran. So anyway, this elevation of the Sunnah above the Quran took another turn, another form, and sort of stronger form than just judging it, because the ulama allege that this Sunnah not only is equal to the Quran, is not only a judge of the Quran, but it can even abrogate, meaning cancel parts of the Quran. Yes, you heard me correctly. So now my question is, how can the words of human being cancel the words of Allah? Please help me out if I'm missing something. To me, this notion of the abrogation of the Quran by man-made tradition is highly problematic. And I'm not alone. Taha Jabir Alwani, once again, he's known as he's a Sunni scholar, but he is known as a neo-traditionalist. So yes, in some ways he's traditional, but in other ways perhaps he's not that traditional. And he also expressed reservations, not just about equating the Sunnah with the Quran. He referred to it as a tragedy. You can find that word in his book, the one I referred to earlier. But he also expresses, reservations about the development, of, a sort of a parallel system of legislation based on the Sunnah, the Hadith. And he also expressed, he also informs his readers that this notion that the Sunnah can abrogate the Quran was there actually from very early in Muslim history, and beginning at 660, in other words, less than 30 years after the demise of the Prophet. The majority of the ulama already subscribe to the teaching that hadith can abrogate a Quranic verse, and they subscribe to the notion that even a solitary hadith can abrogate a Quranic verse. Now, to me, this is really amazing that this ever became part of the accepted teaching of Islam. Because once again, what we are witnessing here is the cancellation and the overruling of words of Allah by the words of a human being. And we have witnessed this, for example, in the another stage of where the Sunnah emerged as superior to the Quran, and this was the stage which now I think falls under jurisprudence because it has to do with law, ruling of the Sharia. And this took place when it was alleged that not only is the Sunnah equal to the Quran, not only does the Sunnah judge the Quran, not only does the Sunnah, abrogate the Quran, parts of the Quran, but it can even, the Sunnah or Hadith can even replace parts of the Quran. Now here we're talking jurisprudence because what we are saying here is that the ruling based on man-made tradition or the Hadith can actually abrogate and replace rulings of God in the Quran. You see, now, do you see the problem here? So are human beings, do they have the power and authority to legislate something different from what Allah legislated in the Quran? Can they legislate in matters of deen in the first place? But it actually has happened. Some rulings of the Quran have been replaced by rulings drawn from traditions. And let me give you 2 or 3 examples. I'm referring specifically to the rulings on apostasy, adultery, and blasphemy. The Quran does not prescribe the death penalty for any of these offenses, yet the Hadith prescribe death penalty for all 3 of these offenses. So you see how the worth of human beings, the man-made traditions, the rulings based on man-made reports and man-made traditions have in fact replaced the rulings of Allah in the Quran. Now, what is this? I am really puzzled. I am stunned, in fact. But these punishments have become part of the mainstream Islam, and they are understood to be part of the Sharia. So how did that happen? You see, in fact, and what do you call when this happens? Well, I came up with a name for this too, and I thought I settled on the expression, I quote, juristic politicism, because, end of quote, and I'm referring to the replacement of the rulings of Allah by rulings of people. I'm referring to that as juristic politicism, because clearly here, in the case of these rulings, which were Allah's rulings, which were replaced by the rulings from human beings, clearly the authority to legislate has been transferred from Allah to a human being, and the human being was in fact allowed to overrule Allah. So it's not just that we are giving Allah a partner. In fact, we are, when you do that, you're actually treating the transmitter of the tradition as even a greater authority than Allah himself. Now please, what do you do with this? And how do you address this? And where do you even begin with this? But anyway, I don't wish to go on talking too long. Perhaps you can, if you have any questions or concerns, you can write to me in the comments below. In the meantime, I will just conclude by saying that here I have taken up 33 minutes to develop my talk, but when it comes to the Oxford Institute for British Islam, I will have less than this amount of time. I am given 15 minutes, so I think I will have to condense whatever I have said here into those 15 minutes and make sure that I don't run over the time limit. But in the meantime, I hope that I have raised some relevant questions and points, and if you think I missed something, please do let me know, because this is work in progress for me too. I'm not claiming that I certainly know it all. I definitely don't. Only Allah knows it all. But I am trying to get a better grip on precisely what went wrong in the Muslim civilization and the Muslim intellectual and political history. And I think the application of a problematic methodology of exegesis and jurisprudence is at the root of the problem. And this has been actually already confirmed by people, other writers, not just Haji Abeir Alwani, whom I already mentioned, but Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, in another scholar associated with the Triple IT Institute in the United States, in Virginia, USA, the Institute for Islamic, how the Triple IT means the Islamic Institute of International Thought. So Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman was also associated with them, and in his book The Crisis in the Muslim Mind, published in 1993 by the Triple IT Institute, he calls for precisely this, a reform not of Islam. Islam, correctly understood, is perfect. I certainly agree with that. But he does call, and I support his call, for a reform of the methodology. In other words, to reform the methodology, we have to let go of all those assumptions that go directly against the Quran. For example, the assumption that the Quran is unclear, the assumption that the Quran is incomplete because it does not contain details on how to pray, and thirdly, the assumption that the Quran is also incoherent because some verses in the Quran contradict other verses, and some ulama have in fact alleged that there are as many as 500 verses of the Quran which are contradicted by other verses. So in other words, in order to and by the way, Zaki Badawi also called for a new methodology of interpreting the Quran, and there are other voices also who are calling for rethinking of the methodology that has been used in traditional Islam to understand the Quran, and to draw the rulings of the Sharia from that understanding. So I think I will also, as I mentioned earlier, the entire doctrine of abrogation, I think, should be basically rejected. And almost, I could add, by the way, that nearly all contemporary writers on the subject have actually expressed similar sentiments. Let me just mention a few names that rejected the doctrine of abrogation. In the old days, it was Abu Muslim al-Isfahani who rejected the doctrine of abrogation on the basis of the three verses which say that we will never find a change in the words of Allah. Yeah, they don't change. So, but if you say that Allah abrogated some of his words, what you are suggesting is that Allah is changing his mind, you see. And if you say that Allah abrogated 500 of his verses, whoever is saying that is suggesting that Allah Ta'ala changed his mind 500 times. Now, don't you think this is more than a little problematic? I think it's very problematic. But anyway, other people that have rejected the doctrine of abrogation include Muhammad Asad, the translator of the Quran, Muhammad Ghazali, whom I already mentioned, Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Muhammad Abdu of Egypt, then his friend and Rashid Rida also rejected the doctrine of abrogation. Even Said Qutb rejected it, Fazlur Rahman rejected it, Ismail Farouqi rejected it, and who else? So we have a significant number, of people that no longer subscribe, or if they ever did, to this doctrine of abrogation. It has caused a lot of problems, for the ummah. But anyway, so like I said, I will wrap it up. And so in order to renew this methodology, one other thing I would add is that we also have to de-sacralize tradition. In other words, don't treat it as something sacred, like don't treat the hadith as a revelation, because when you do that, what you are doing is you are making tradition or the ways of the forefathers sacred and even equal to the Quran, and that is really going too far. I think we have to back away from that, and the sooner we do it, the better it will be for the Ummah. So the desacralization of tradition should also help to solve the problems of what I have termed the scriptural and juristic politism, or elements of juristic and scriptural politism in the traditional methodology of Islam. Because once you stop treating tradition as sacred, it has no authority over revelation, and it will have to be treated as subordinate in every case without exception to the teaching of revelation. So I think I will leave it at that. Thank you once again for your time and attention, and as I said, if you have any questions or concerns, please leave them in the comments below, and I will do what I can to address your concerns. And by the way, for those who are free and who will see this video in time, do drop in on our talk at the Oxford Institute for British Islam, which will be broadcast soon on the internet. Just type in the Oxford Institute for British Islam to obtain the link to become a participant and observer of the proceedings of this conference. So in the meantime, thank you very much. Peace and blessings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Thank you.